It is now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, activist, author, and chair of the Food and Water Watch Board, Maude Barlow. I am so thrilled to have Maude here today. Maude is a hero of mine. We go back decades in the work to save people and the planet. She is an inspiration to people around the world. Maude is also the author of many, many books, including Whose Water Is It Anyway? Taking Water Protection into Public Hands, Still Hopeful Lessons from a Lifetime of Activism, and her new book on the financialization of nature called Earth for Sale: The Fight to Stop the Last Plunder of the Planet. Please join me in welcoming Maude Barlow. Maude, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, Wenonah, thank you. And I'm embarrassed after that introduction. It's just me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, congratulations on your new and very important book. You know, we've known each other for more than 25 years, and I often think back to our work about fighting water privatizations, those terrible private contracts that the World Bank and IMF were forcing on countries in the global south. Maud, I think our participants would really be interested in knowing how you came to this work on water and what brought you around then to the financialization of nature.
Well, just delighted to be with you, Wenonah, and all the wonderful people who are fans of Food and Water Watch, as of course I am. And I just want to say thank you so much for back to you for the tireless work you've done. I was back in the 1980s. For me, water is something that came out of the tap. I never thought about it, except when I knew about certain pollution. There were campaigns around local pollution and so on. But I was sitting reading the first of the modern free trade agreements, which was the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which then morphed into NAFTA, then morphed into the one that's being renewed now, or maybe not. And I was looking at the annex at the end that listed all the goods that are going to be subject to the rules of the trade agreement, which basically means the market's going to take over from governments and make decisions. And there, along with running shoes and cars, was water, including ice and snow. And I could not understand how it was possible that water, like what was water doing in there? What was water doing as a tradable good in a trade agreement? What could that possibly mean? And that set me on a journey, Wenonah, which is how I met you. And we ended up working together to ask the question, who owns water? Who's making decisions around who has access to
Yeah.
water? We knew there were people in the global south without access to water. We knew even in our own countries there were, but we thought it was just simply an issue of poverty and injustice around that. But we did not understand what we now understand, and that is way before we were talking about this, there were powerful private interests that said, we know that on a planet running out of clean water, whoever controls water is going to be both powerful and wealthy. And that started us on a journey to say, no, we don't have to allow water to be to go on the market like oil and gas. Water is a human right and a public trust and must remain so. So originally we fought privatization of municipal services, as you said, and I want to say we did some very, very powerful work, particularly here in North America. We have slowed it or stopped it to a great extent. We fought water commodification when big mining companies or big ag companies or big energy operations get these contracts, 50, 60, 70-year contracts. We might call it a land grab, but it's the water as much as the land they were after, and now they own the water. They can dump whatever they want in it. More recently, we've been fighting the whole concept of transitioning water rights in the U.S. West and water licensing in other countries like Chile and Australia into water markets, where the market takes over the running of, and the profit motive takes over the running of water. This has been more recent, but more recently, I realized that we had entered a new stage. Water was making huge profits on the stock markets, and people were noticing investors making money from green bonds and blue bonds and nature stocks, and talk of water future. And it struck me that we were entering a new phase in the financialization of nature and the financialization of water.
Well, I think one thing that we learned in our water work is that people from all walks of life get it about water. And what we've seen in big water privatization battles, even here in the US, is that people don't want a private company controlling their water or the park where their water comes from. And I think once they understand financialization, they'll feel the same way. So, Earth for Sale documents this new phase of plundering of nature and water. Can you explain financialization? I think you do the best job of making this understandable of anyone in our movement.
Well, thank you, Wenonah. Really, the financialization of nature is much less like the, excuse me, this is just an old cold that's gone, is much like the financialization of the economy, where instead of putting money into goods and services, the best money is put into speculation, into risk, into trying to decide where the biggest profits are. So the financialization of nature basically converts natural resources, ecosystems, and their so-called services. And that tells you something right away about the notion that nature and the earth exist to serve us. Just that term itself, I think we should question. But it takes the nature, and it turns nature into tradable financial assets, and such as carbon credits, biodiversity offsets, and green bonds. Transnational corporations, the global equity funds, particularly the big asset managers, they are huge players in this. Along with the big ag companies and the energy companies and the chemical companies and the water companies, the folks who brought us this crisis in the first place have become very, very keen to get in on the profit of bringing nature into the market, and the recent understanding that we have to come to terms with the environmental damage that we have created. So they become players in the transition to what they call nature-based solutions, which again sounds very good. But from a market perspective, nature-based solution has to make profits. So their answer to the climate crisis is put a price on nature, bring it into the market, and let the market, not governments, and this is a very important concept here, let the market, not governments or communities, guide the process. So where governments will use regulatory measures to protect nature, the market treats it as an asset to be bought, traded, and sold. And too many governments are happy to contract out. We know about contracting out when governments take a public service and turn it over to a private company to run it at a profit. We know what happens. This is a form of contracting out the responsibility of governments to care for our natural resources and take care of them. And they are strongly encouraged along this path, I'm afraid, by several major global financial conservation groups like the Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund, who have many of the corporations causing the problems on their board. They are promoting this very much. And also promoting it are well-meaning investors who say, I want to do something. I know my governments aren't doing enough. I knew that we have a crisis, so I want to invest in green bonds and blue bonds and nature-based solutions. And so you get huge money going into the private sector now to protect nature. So all the corporation or the asset company has to do is claim to be green or blue or biodiverse, and they get money from pension funds, they get money from university endowments, big NGOs put money into it, and wealthy families into this green investment. And they're also cashing in, and this is very important, in the trillions of dollars the governments have freed up, the UN and the World Bank have freed up in recent years for biodiversity protection, this so-called 30 by 30 that all countries have agreed to, or most countries have agreed to protect 30% of their, or rewild 30% of their land and waters off their coast. So it's basically saying, here we are, we're going to take over now. We're going to take over the climate file. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to understand how anyone who's looked at the boom bust cycle of markets could take this kind of thing seriously.
A similar approach, yes.
Well, like Food and Water Watch, I know you've been highly critical of carbon trading and other so called market mechanisms that are meant to deal with the climate crisis. And these mechanisms are supported by many governments and international institutions like the UN and World Bank. Can you talk a little bit about this, their stated purpose and why they're so flawed?
Yeah, their stated purpose is to meet the commitments on climate and other environmental crises through the market, not through regulation. And basically, they say through the market is more sensible. That is the natural place for it to come from. So, in essence, corporations can go about their business, including continuing to pollute. This is very important. And very much more important, governments and the economic system the system that exists doesn't have to be questioned. We'll tinker over here and we'll do our trading, green trading over here, but basically the notion of unlimited growth continues, at a furious pace, and we can continue to make money. So in essence, they can go about their business as long as they offset their environmental damage that they're continuing to do by doing something friendly for the environment somewhere else. As I say earlier, it's a form of contracting out to the responsibility of governments to the private sector. Now, it's important to say that the original impetus for this was actually quite well-meaning. Scientists and environmentalists said, look, in a market economy, in a capitalist system, if you don't put a value on something, you're not going to protect it. So why don't we do an assessment and find out what nature is giving us? Let's put a dollar figure on the services nature gives to us. And again, I remind us that it's not the other way. What do we owe the earth? It's all, what does nature do for us, and can it compete? Should it be allowed to be protected? If it's, what's it doing for us? So you have, for instance, if you have to want to prove that a forest has more valuable, an old growth forest, standing than being logged, then you can protect it. So environmentalists were saying, well, let's prove that it's really valuable. But of course, the corollary to that is, if you could make more money on that forest by cutting down the trees in a market economy, that's what you're going to do. So what we've got is governments all over the world measuring, what I call measuring creation, going in and putting a dollar figure on their lakes and their wetlands and their forests and so on. Probably not in the United States at the federal level right now under the current administration, but many states would be doing this, and certainly it's happening in my country, happening all over Europe. And as I say, I call it measuring creation. And the current value, they actually put value on the ecosystem services at the moment is estimated to be about $125 trillion. That's what nature gives humans. So as nature enters the market, it starts with the boom. So carbon markets, of course, are the largest and the most sophisticated and the ones we've had the longest in terms of the environmental trading market, and it allows corporations to compensate for their greenhouse gas emissions and continue to emit those greenhouse gases and continue to pollute by reducing emissions elsewhere. So technically, for every metric ton of greenhouse gas emission that you can claim to be have removed somewhere else or prevented, and claim is the operative word here, Wenonah. When the scams, the stories. I mean, I couldn't stop writing about the different examples of just dishonest places that so these so-called corporations were saving. But for every metric ton of a greenhouse gas that they save one place, they get a credit, and then they can they can trade it. It has been exposed thoroughly. I expose it in my book, but it's been exposed well in other places. But it is continuing to grow. The carbon market is still continuing to gallop, and that's because it's the only game in town. As governments give away this responsibility, we know the market mechanism is flawed, but that's where we go. And more recently, we have biodiversity trading that places a value on habitat or a plant or an animal. And that allows a corporation to continue to harm the local habitat, right, while getting a credit for supposedly conserving natural assets elsewhere. The International Monetary Fund is putting a dollar figure on wildlife, mostly so that they can use it for ecotourism. And they say that an elephant is worth $1.5 million, and a whale is now officially worth $2 million. So, and the idea, of course, is to protect this whale and this elephant because they're now so valuable. But of course, you can see where the profit comes in. And now the most recent is plastics offsets. And we have a huge plastics crisis in the world. So when big bottled water companies, just for instance, say, well, we're going to get to a net zero waste, or we're going to, for all the water we use, we're going to reduce an equivalent amount somewhere else. The schemes, I mean, one of them, for instance, is in a small fishing community in Indonesia, and they send mountains of plastic recycled for recycling bottled water, and they train what they call trash engineers, just the local people, to come and get the bottles. They put up a recycling plant that cannot handle the mountains of garbage that they're being sent. And Greenpeace did a study and found that they were burning the plastic in empty fields and in their backyards. But yet the companies are able to say, I get a credit because I've done this wonderful thing on the other side of the world. And the plastics use, as we know, is going up and up and up. So it's really, when you look at overall, does any of them individually okay? Perhaps. But as a model, the model is profoundly wrong.
This is so cynical. It's hard to believe that people buy into this. It's really shocking.
Well, as you know, there's so much else to concern us right now, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Is that you want to work on this, but there are the I don't even have to tell you. The
Yeah.
situation is, so our attention goes there, and we continue to allow this to take over. And our governments are cash strapped. A lot of them are putting money, as you know, into so-called defense and so on. So this kind of rolls along to the advantage of the private sector.
Yeah. Well, Maude, for many years, you've been writing that our planet is running out of water and that we're going to face a catastrophic collapse of the water table. Can you discuss how commodifying and privatizing water and turning the care of rivers and lakes to the market is going to affect water for the future?
Yeah, I think if we had infinite amount of water on the planet, which I guess a lot of us at one point thought perhaps we did, we taught back in grade 6 that you can't go anywhere. But of course, we've diverted and dammed our rivers to death. We're over extracting our groundwater. We're polluting continuing to pollute, as you well know. So we have a crisis. We have a very serious crisis. And the most recent UN study said that have now moved beyond what they call a water crisis into a state of global water bankruptcy, which basically means that the demand is growing way faster
Yeah.
than the supply. And we go through communities and cities. I mean, we look at what's happening in Tehran, we think about war. They were about to move the people of Tehran because there is no water left. The groundwater is gone. It's gone. And we're going to be beginning to see desalination plants hit because, of course, water wars is part of all wars. And as a result, a full quarter of the world's population drinks water contaminated with feces every single day. And one half of the people of the world have no access to basic sanitation. So, and we continue to plunder our water relentlessly. We have what I call this myth of abundance, so that, we'll never run out, of course, until we do. And in North America, as you well know, Wenonah, because you're the leader in sounding the alarm on this, we are ramping up energy, chemical, rare mineral mining production, putting huge burdens on our water, more fracking, more contamination, more depletion of water. And a special statement must be made about artificial intelligence and the data centers, the water, massive amounts of water they consume, not just use, but consume. We're very concerned, all of us, but particularly the Canadians and Americans together around the Great Lakes. We're coming together to sound the alarm that there are hundreds of data centers already on the Great Lakes, but hundreds more planned. The Chicago-based Alliance for the Great Lakes has put out a very powerful report. They said that these mega centers, data centers on the Great Lakes, could drain the already endangered groundwater supplies of the Great Lakes. And as it is now, the St. Lawrence River water levels are at an historic low. It's not like, water can go, and water can go very quickly. And I want to say big shout out to Food and Water Watch for the leadership you've shown, for calling for a moratorium on new AI data centers, and as has the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights to water and sanitation. Called for a moratorium, saying we're going to destroy what's left of the planet's water. Newer threats, however, as we evolve into this financialization stage, include giant water grabs by giant water asset companies and what are called water management companies in the water scarce area of your country, of the U.S. West. They're buying farmland, but they're not buying the farmland for the farmland. They're buying it to sell, often to hoard for speculation, knowing that the price is going to rise as water becomes scarce. One asset manager, American manager, asset manager, said clean water is the biggest emerging market on earth. And now we have water offsets where a company, especially bottled water companies, but all the plastic companies, get to continue to consume local water sources if they offset it by doing something far away, out of sight. And ditto on water pollution trading. Food and Water Watch has done the pioneer work on this, where the big factory farms get to continue to dump their pollution in the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, because they buy their way or they trade their way out of their right to pollute. So we already have the examples, but we're kind of moving into the new stage of it, and it's very, very disturbing.
Definitely is disturbing. And one of the things that gives me hope is kind of the fight back on data centers and the fact that in red states and blue states,
Yes.
people with different ideologies are coming together
Yes.
to fight these data centers. And part of what they're fighting about is the huge threat to water resources.
Yeah.
So I do think that when
And I just just want to say, Wenonah, we in Canada are learning from the wonderful work you've done in the U.S. We're beginning to see those fightbacks right here as well. So your work there is being copied in other countries.
And I just think it speaks to how important it is to talk to people about issues like financialization. I think if most people had any idea what is going on and how these huge economic interests are planning to benefit from natural resources, they would be shocked. So I think it really argues to speaking plainly about these issues and getting the information out there. So I know one of the other problems that destroying the planet by private interests and this financialization has caused and is continuing to cause is the rise of social inequality. Can you say a little bit more about this?
Well, I don't have to tell you or your audience about the terrible role that the billionaire class
Yeah.
in your country, but in other countries as well, soon to be, by the way, a trillionaire class, that's going to happen this year, 2026, is setting the political and economic agenda to suit their interests. They don't want democracy. They don't want regulations. They don't want to disclose, for instance, their water use in AI. And I know a number of American AI companies are coming to Canada and saying, we don't want regulations. Don't put any regulations on us that we don't have in the US or we won't come. And they want to replace the US Treasury with cryptocurrency. They want to privatize the financial system. They use offshore tax havens to avoid paying taxes that we desperately need for proper protection of water and the climate. And they're happy to have an administration that gives them free rein to explore and pollute as they wish and as far and wide as they wish. So while meanwhile the population is left thinking, well, at least something is being done with the creation of nature markets, like putting first people reading this book, doing editing at my publisher said, "Oh, I invest in green bonds. I thought I was doing a good thing," which is not a bad thing, from an individual perspective, but just as you say, Wenonah, it's turning the lens and understanding what this really means. So it's true, and I want to say this, that there are people in the corporate world who care. And by the way, when I speak about corporations, I'm talking the big transnationals. I'm not talking about the wonderful businesses and communities that are often the leader in sustainability and caring and looking after the environment and the local people in their community. So that's not what we're talking about here. But even some in the large corporations care, but they're at a disadvantage when the rules favor the most ruthless, which is why we need governance, we need good governance, we need regulations. We cannot tackle the climate crisis until we address the deeply unjust reality of life between those in the global south and the global north, and then what I call the global south of the global north, the social inequality within our own societies. George Monbiot of the Guardian says it beautifully. He says, climate breakdown is the result of a global failure to address the power of private capital. Kind of sums it up. Until we deal with this, until we deal with the money that these people have and the way they're influencing, the way that they're using it to influence governments to turn away from their responsibility to care for the climate crisis, because they can buy their way out of it for a while, let's face it. We're not going to tackle one without tackling the other.
So you make a very strong case for democratic and community control of nature. Can you talk a little about how you've seen this work in other places, and also the need for governments and international institutions to create more regulations to protect nature?
Yeah, we cannot heal the earth by trusting the very corporations that have done the majority of damage. Like there's one recent study that shows that the amount of money that corporations, the private sector and public sector put into nature damaging projects is something like 30 times more than the money that we put into nature healing projects. I mean, the balance is just so wrong. And we're not going to get it right as long as these corporations and asset managers and trillionaires control the agenda. There are three reasons to reject the financialization of nature and require that governments step up and do what they're supposed to do. This is their responsibility. We have the right to demand this. The first is that without regulations, private companies are free to go back on their green promises. It's all voluntary and most of it's performative anyway. But witness how fast the big oil companies in the United States and Canada as well backed off their net zero promises, their pledges, when Trump came to power and said, forget about it. We're not, nobody's holding your feet to the fire on that. They literally dropped it like a hot potato. Now, they haven't dropped the shiny brochures showing breaching whales and flying eagles and saying we've taken over the climate file and yes, it's real, but we're going to look after it. So because there's still huge investment money to be made in the file, but they're not in it to look after the environment. And the minute they don't have to, they back off. The second reason is that we have lost decades in the fight by trusting this false solution. Every time we put money into these nature bonds or we let the market take over the responsibility, we say to governments, it's okay, you're don't worry about it. It's being taken care of over here, and we don't do what we need to do. Can anyone honestly argue that the planet is better than it was 10, 20 years ago in terms of water, in terms of the climate, in terms of the warming oceans, in terms of the fact that we're going to have more plastic in the ocean than fish in the near future? So it's quite the opposite. Finally, turning this so-called care of nature to the private sector has allowed, and I would say deepened, the very great inequality that is the basis of the crisis. As the poor get poorer, and they are getting poorer, and they lose power, they will sell what they need to sell in order, whether it's their local soil or forests or water, they'll sell what they have to sell to survive. And let me tell you, there are plenty of billionaires. If you've got a market, if it's a market of sellers who are poor and desperate and buyers who are billionaires, there are a lot of buyers for cheap nature.
Well, can you say a little bit more about the global movement that's fighting for the rights of nature and the rights of rivers?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the rights of nature, but I want to start off by saying really strongly that I am not suggesting it should replace government regulation. We need regulations and urgently need regulation at the community, municipal, state, federal, and international level to protect nature, to stop the climate, the deepening of the climate crisis, and so on. So I want to be very clear that I'm not saying this instead of that, because there are people saying give up on governments. They're forget about it. Let's just do this at a local level. And I say it's not an either or. But I also want to say, yeah, we urgently need strong measures to protect and restore fresh water. We need strong regulations around who has access to groundwater and to stop pollution. Like that's got to happen by law. But many communities have become impatient or discouraged, saying we're waiting for governments, and it's like they're not here. Either the legislation isn't okay or it's not being properly enforced. So the rights of nature is a movement that's kind of growing up from the grassroots all over the world. The rights of nature asserts that ecosystems, wildlife, the earth itself are living beings with inherent rights to exist, evolve, and regenerate. When you think that the U.S. Supreme Court gave corporations a legal identity as persons, what we are now saying is we need to recognize that nature has rights outside of its services for us. One of my favorite is in my country in northern Quebec. They've made a mighty river called the Magpie River, which travels south into the St. Lawrence, and it's one of the few wild rivers left in North America. The local Innu people, with the local councilors, declared it to be a protected legal entity, and they have many protections to flow and to regenerate and so on. But the last one is the Magpie River has the right to sue, and the guardians are the local Inuit people who speak for the river. There are now over 500 rights of nature projects in 44 countries around the world. It's a development that the UN General Secretary Gutierrez says is the fastest growing legal movement of the 21st century. It's very much grassroots, it's very much community based. It empowers to take action that will trickle up as the pressure is placed to make governments do better. It's it's not a replacement for the laws that we need. I just want to quote again George Monbiot, the Guardian, because he explains what happens when we disengage from nature. He says the financialization of nature is the definitive expression of our disengagement from the living world. First, we lose our wildlife and natural wonders. Then we use our connections with what remains of life on Earth. Then we lose the words that described what we once knew. Then we call it capital and give it a price.
Yeah.
This approach is morally wrong, intellectually vacuous, and emotionally alienating and self-defeating. So the rights of nature is the antidote to this notion that nature's finished or nature doesn't matter or nature exists to serve us. I was at a very high-level, high-tech high school in Germany a couple of years ago and spoke to the students. They were wonderful. They became a blue school. But the principal didn't like my message. And he brought me up to his office after with some of the staff and a group of selected students and senior students. And he said, now, Maude, I think you're against technology. And I said, well, I got here on a plane and I've written 20-some books on a computer. So no, but I don't want us thinking technology is going to solve all that we're doing. But then he said, I have friends, scientist friends, who say, we don't need these wild animals. Let them go. This rewilding is crazy. Let's, the 30 by 30 he disagreed with. He said, let's forget that. He said, he kept talking about his friends, his scientist friends who knew that we can grow all our food in cities and so on. And he said, what do you say to that, Ms. Barlow? And I said, I think you need new friends. The students loved it. But he was an example of the disengagement from the natural world. And when you think of how many billions of young people are growing up in places where they don't ever touch the earth and they don't, touch trees and they don't see animals and they don't see flocks of birds and they don't breathe clean air, they don't have that connection. And that's the disenchantment, which I say the corporations are taking advantage of. So the rights of nature, the rights of river is a way of local people connecting to our local ecosystems and saying we have a right to what happens to that lake or that river. That's right there. That's in my backyard, and I have a right. And it's very interesting that in many of these cases, it's local indigenous communities that are leading the fight. And they are aided by the UN resolution, on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that say they have rights to protect the resources within their territories. And I think you're going to see an assertion of this as we move through the next decade and we realize that this has been a false solution, a false promise, and we have to come back and do the hard work of loving and protecting our earth.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing with the Trump administration is because they are so out there and anti-regulation, I think it is beginning to open some people's eyes about what this really means and who these people really are. So we have to speak plainly about these things and give people the opportunity to hear about them, but we don't want to make it so that they have no hope. I know you have hope, Maude. Can you talk a little bit about it and what has kept you going?
Well, if we don't have hope, we're giving up on the young. And how dare we give up on
Yeah.
the young? I mean, how dare we? I've got 4 young adult grandchildren, and I adore them, and I'm not giving up on a clean, safe planet for them to live in and grow up in. So, and I look back, Wenonah, you say, what gives us hope? I mean, you remember the fight to get the
Yeah.
United Nations to recognize the human rights to water and sanitation. People say, what? I don't understand that. Of course,
Yeah.
water's a human right. No, it wasn't. My government at the time was actually totally opposed to it and got up and stormed out whenever the discussion came up. I mean, we didn't think we were going to win that. We won it, but there were lots of abstentions. So, we can win when we persevere, but
Yes.
we can't persevere without hope. And I borrow a term from a wonderful American spiritualist, Joan Halifax, who does work with men on death row. So you can imagine she has something interesting to say about hope. She coined a term, wise hope, which basically says it's not Pollyanna, everything's fine, or it's totally negative, everything's awful, so there's no point in doing anything. In fact, those have kind of a lot in common. Wise hope means that you have to look the issue in the face, learn as much as you can about it, don't deny it, and take action anyway. So it's basically saying, you're going to fight for a planet, a just and clean planet. You're going to, knowing that you can't control the outcome, not thinking, oh, well, I lost that, so I'm just going to go off and sulk. It's not, it's way more complicated than that. But that you have to put your hand out and touch the universe in a place where you feel that you can make a difference. It doesn't have to be huge, doesn't have to be everything. You can't carry the whole burden by yourself. And this is really important. You have to have faith that others are doing something maybe the same, very similar, but people are doing actions of hope around the world, that there is a deep goodness down in things, as the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins said, a deep dearness down in things, and that we have to find that. We have to tap into that. And we owe it to the young. Hope is a moral imperative. And I love that this is connecting up to the arts community, because without writers and without musicians and without filmmakers and without painters and without people with that artistic ability to translate the academic or the day-to-day into poetry or tragedy, but that touches our hearts, touches our souls. If we don't have that, we don't have a movement. The artists are so important to our movement and so important to the work that we collectively do. So hope is a moral imperative. And I just will end with the quote from Banksy, the wonderful British cartoonist, if you will, artist. He says, if you're tired, learn to rest, not to quit.
It's a wonderful quote. Well, you have certainly not quit, Maude. And
No,
thank you so much for writing Earth for Sale and for being with us today.
thank you, Wenonah. It's been my entire pleasure.
Wow. Thank you both, Maude and Wenonah, so much. What a gift from two inspiring women who have not quit. I love the idea of wise hope, and I love the description Maude gave. In fact, I wrote it down when she said it because I think it's worth repeating. She said you have to look the issue in the face, learn as much as you can about it, and take action anyway. And as you just heard, that is exactly what Maude does, and really what we're all doing today and every day together. For me, it's being in community with all of you and being inspired by people like Wenonah and Maude that help make that happen. So thank you again, Maude Barlow, for all you do to protect the planet and for your new book, Earth for Sale, The Fight to Stop the Last Plunder of the Planet. Earth for Sale was just released a few days ago, so likely you haven't read it yet. I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of this book, and I highly recommend it. We're putting the link in the chat now, so you can check it out for yourself and get a copy for your local library.